Our guests to take our seats, and the Subcommittee of Health will now come to order. Recognize myself 5 minutes for an opening statement, and this morning certainly want to welcome our witnesses. We're here to conduct oversight and receive updates on the implementation on one of the most substantial legislative accomplishments in the space of biomedical innovation, the 21st Century Cures Act. Cures passed both the House and the Senate with wide bipartisan support and was signed into law December of 2016. As with all landmark laws, I think it is critical that the Congress, especially the relevant authorizing committee, engage in oversight to ensure that the agencies are implementing the law according with legislative intent. Based upon the active leadership and robust activities of both the National Institute of Health and the Food and Drug Administration, I look forward to hearing from Dr. Francis Collins, the Director of National Institutes of Health, and Dr. Scott Gottlieb, the Commissioner of the Food and Drug Administration, regarding progress in implementing cures. I thank our witnesses for their willingness to testify on such an important topic. The 21st Century Cures Act provides hope to those who need it the most, individuals and families suffering from life-altering, often life-threatening illnesses. Whether it is cancer or a rare disease or Alzheimer's, there are conditions that are costly to Americans of all ages and their families. Sadly, we each know too well the financial and the human toll that diseases place on our friends and our communities. One of the most impactful positions of the 21st Century Cures created the NIH Innovation Account in Treasury. This account funds projects like those related to Precision Medicine Initiative, the Brain Research through Advancing Innovation and Neurotechnologies Initiative, Cancer Research, and Regenerative Medicine. The pace and breadth of biomedical research continues to accelerate, and as we know, now have treatments to cure diseases such as hepatitis C, which was once unimaginable. Yet there is still much we do not know, especially regarding the neurodegenerative diseases. 21st Century Cures included a provision to establish a national neurological conditions surveillance system. Prior to cures, there was no requirement or authorization to provide surveillance of neurologic disease, but this changed thanks to cures. Specifically, this section of law requires the Secretary of the Department of Health and Human Services to create such a system by expanding surveillance infrastructure and activities, including data collection to determine prevalence, risk factors, and diagnostic and progression markers. Preliminary results from an ongoing Multiple Sclerosis Society study show that there are nearly 1 million Americans living with MS, more than twice the previously reported number. The surveillance system included in cures will provide us better information so that we can further our understanding of and eventually cure these diseases. I'm especially grateful to see progress in this important policy. This began as a standalone bill introduced in the previous Congress. Additionally, cures advance precision medicine, which allows physicians to offer their patients truly personalized treatment. Achieving the full potential of precision medicine will require effort to collect health data, in addition to the research done by our nation's best research investigators. The law codifies the Precision Medicine Initiative and encourages the Secretary of Health and Human Services to carry out the goals of the initiative while ensuring confidentiality of the patient's information. The All of Us research program is a major piece of the Precision Medicine Initiative and has already engaged over 1 million volunteers in the United States. I think you're to be congratulated for that. Clinical trials play a crucial and necessary role in the drug approval process. While the Food and Drug Administration's traditional clinical trial methods have proven successful, they are not always timely or applicable to new types of drugs. Cures requires the Food and Drug Administration to evaluate its trial designs and issue guidance for the purposes of incorporating complex, adaptive, and other novel trial designs. The innovation and promising results of efforts included in cures will provide Americans suffering from cancer and other diseases with the opportunity to undergo successful treatments and, in some cases, be cured. So our thanks to Dr. Collins, Dr. Gottlieb for giving us the updates on the implementation of this new law. I'll yield the balance of my time to the gentlelady from Tennessee, Ms. Blackburn, for a statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And Dr. Collins and Dr. Gottlieb, we're delighted that you are here. Two things that I'm going to want to discuss with you all. Dr. Collins, the All of Us research project, and making certain that we anonymize and that we protect the data that is in that program, and that the privacy of the patients with data is respected as we move forward with this. And Dr. Gottlieb, following up on the Software Act and making certain that the implementation is going well. And we welcome you both. We look forward to the hearing. Yield back.
Chair, thanks, gentlemen. Then the chair yields back. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from Texas, the ranking member of the subcommittee, Mr. Green. 5 minutes for an opening statement, please.
Mr. Chairman, thank you for holding today's hearing on the implementation of the 21st Century Cures Act. I want to thank all our witnesses for being here today, especially Dr. Collins from NIH and Dr. Gottlieb from FDA. You're pretty regulars at that table. And for being here. This December will mark the 2-year anniversary of the 21st Century Cures Act being signed into law by President Obama in his last public signing ceremony. The promise of the 21st Century Cures is to advance the discovery and development of new treatments, cures through increased research and improved drug approval process. This important law dedicated $6.3 billion in new investments to support medical research initiatives like the Bo Biden Cancer Moonshot, the Brain Initiative, the Precision Medicine Initiative within the National Institute of Health. It also provides money to the Food and Drug Administration to advance the agency's mission and implement the policies in the underlying bill. I hope our committee and Congress that these investments are being put toward finding a cure for many of our nation's greatest medical priorities and ensuring the infrastructure is in place so the new therapies are accessible to all Americans. The NIH was provided $4.8 billion in new funding and advanced cutting-edge research initiatives. The FDA was provided $500 million over 10 years to improve the agency's medical product review process and expedite patient access to drugs and devices without compromising standards of safety and effectiveness. In addition to this much-needed funding, there are many provisions in this package worthy of support, from facilitating the development of new antibiotics to fight against superbugs to advancing the use of modern clinical trial designs to investing in the next generation of medical researchers. While some of the provisions are technical in nature, the real-world impact could not have to be not abstract. Patients and families deserve to have their elected officials respond to their needs. The 21st Century Cures was written to do just that. This morning is an opportunity to hear from the heads of the FDA and NIH on implementation of the many provisions of this law, from patient-focused drug development, medical device innovation, and improving scientific expertise and hiring capacities. Many members of our committee were instrumental in getting cures developed and signed into the law, most notably Representative Diane DeGette and Representative Fred Upton. The 21st Century Cures Act demonstrates what we can accomplish when we work across the aisle. I look forward to hearing from our witnesses about the oncoming implementation of the 21st Century Cures. And Mr. Chairman, I yield the remainder of my time to my colleague, Congresswoman Diane DeGette.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chairman, or Mr. Ranking Member, for yielding. And I just want to add my thanks to everybody here, in particular Dr. Collins and Dr. Gottlieb and all of their staffs who helped us develop this bill, and most especially my compadre Fred Upton, who's sitting over there, who really worked with us every day. But this really was a work product of this entire committee, and it shows the greatness of the Energy and Commerce Committee and what we can do when we decide to work together to tackle a serious problem. Mr. Chairman, I also want to thank you for having this series of hearings. It's about a year and a half since the bill has been signed, and it's almost exactly 2 years since we originally passed it through this committee. We need to make sure that everything we intended to do in cures is happening. And if the agencies need modifications or changes or additional resources, that we give that all due consideration. And the only way we can do that is to have hearings like this. I do want to say that I've been concerned lately reading some media accounts that say that some of the cures money may be reprogrammed for other purposes, including for the ORR issues of the kids at the border. You know, we should be able to find the money to do that without taking money away from important biomedical research and drug and device approval at the FDA. So I hope that's not the case, and if it is, I hope this committee acts swiftly and in a bipartisan way to make sure that the intended monies that we authorized in this committee remain, because we still have so many bridges to cross, and we're going to need every penny that we authorized. With that, thank you very much, Mr. Green, for yielding, and I yield back.
Chair, thanks, the gentleman. The gentleman yields back. Pending the arrival of the chairman of the full committee, the chair now recognizes the ranking member of the full committee, Mr. Bologna, New Jersey. 5 minutes for opening statement, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to thank Dr. Collins, Dr. Gottlieb, Dr. Sharpless, and Dr. Devaney for all joining us to discuss the ongoing work at NIH and FDA to implement the 21st Century Cures Act. And of course, I also want to thank our colleagues Diana DeGette and Fred Upton, without which the Cures Act would never have become law. The Cures Act tasks both of your agencies with implementing critical provisions aimed at improving the discovery and development of new treatments and cures. At NIH, the law provided significant funding for the Beau Biden Cancer Moonshot Initiative, the All of Us Research Program, and the BRAIN Initiative. And at FDA, the law included provisions to improve the medical product review process, as well as new authorities and funding to ensure the agency has the resources to recruit the best talent. At our hearing on this topic last November, you both provided promising updates, and I look forward to your continued work. As I said before, it's important to hold oversight hearings like these that allow us to learn directly from the administration how policies are being implemented. While I'm pleased that the subcommittee has decided to conduct continued oversight of the Cures Act, there are several topics within the subcommittee's jurisdiction that also deserve hearings and oversight. For example, I've asked the majority to schedule hearings on a number of issues that are priorities for Democratic members of the committee. I've asked for hearings on maternal mortality, health disparities, gun violence, the Indian Health Service, cosmetics reform, the Office of Refugee Resettlement, drug pricing, abuse of the REMS program, and marketplace stabilization. And these are all different issues within the subcommittee's jurisdiction, and we may have different opinions on many of them, but that's exactly why we should at least have a hearing. And these are critical issues that this committee should be discussing in an effort to find potential solutions. So I hope in the coming weeks after the August recess that the chairman will respond and select a few of these issues to hold hearings on in the short time we have left for this Congress. And unless someone else wants my time, I'll yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Chair, thanks, gentleman. Gentleman yields back. The chair will hold the time for the opening statement of the chairman of the full committee, but pending his arrival, let me thank our witnesses for being here today and taking time to testify before the subcommittee. We're going to give our witnesses an opportunity to give an opening statement that will be followed by questions from members. Today we are going to hear from the Honorable Francis Collins, the Director of the National Institute of Health, and the Honorable Scott Gottlieb, Commissioner of the Food and Drug Administration. And Dr. Collins, it's my understanding you have brought a supporting cast of Dr. Norman Sharpless, the 15th Director of the National Cancer Institute, and Dr. Stephanie Devaney, who is the Deputy Director of the All of Us Research Program. I don't know if it's intention for all of you to give an opening statement, but we'll start with you then, Dr. Collins, and you're recognized for 5 minutes for an opening statement, please.
Thank you and good morning, Chairman Burgess, Ranking Member Green, and other distinguished committee members. It's a great honor to appear before you again today, along with my colleague, FDA Commissioner Dr. Scott Gottlieb, to give you a progress report on our implementation of the 21st Century Cures Act. Also joining me, as you've just introduced, the head of the Cancer Institute, Ned Sharpless, and Deputy Director of the All of Us program, Dr. Stephanie Devaney. I can't emphasize enough for this subcommittee how much we appreciate your bipartisan leadership in passing this act, 51-0, as I recall, out of Energy and Commerce, which aims to speed the translation of scientific discoveries into life-saving treatments and cures. In the written statement I've submitted, I've outlined a comprehensive report on how NIH is working swiftly to implement the Act's provisions one by one. That most especially includes multi-year support for 4 specific areas of scientific opportunity supported by the Act's Innovation Fund. Today, I'd like to highlight two of these, the Cancer Moonshot and the bold new precision medicine initiative called All of Us. The Cancer Moonshot is aggressively pursuing a very ambitious goal to accelerate advances in cancer prevention, diagnosis, treatment, and care. Such advances include immunotherapy, in which a person's own immune system is taught to recognize and attack cancer cells. After years of research supported by NIH, immunotherapy is leading to dramatic cures of some cancers like leukemia, lymphoma, and melanoma. But some other cancers, particularly solid tumors like colon, pancreas, breast, and prostate, have proven much less responsive. Thank you. The slides are now up there. I'm thrilled to tell you that some of those barriers seem ready to come down. Just last month, a team led by NIH's Dr. Steven Rosenberg announced a novel modification of an immunotherapy approach that led to a complete regression, most likely a cure, of widely metastatic breast cancer in a woman with previously universally fatal form of the disease. As always, I have to counsel patients. This success story for solid tumors like breast cancer involves very few cases right now and must be replicated in further studies. But without doubt, this woman's life-saving experience represents hope for millions more. As exciting as potential cures like this can be, in authorizing and funding the Cancer Moonshot, you wisely tasked NIH with advancing not just cancer therapies, but also cancer care. Let me tell you about an NIH-funded trial that beautifully illustrates the progress we are making in this area. Each year, as many as 135,000 American women who've undergone surgery for the most common form of early-stage breast cancer face a very difficult decision, whether or not to also undergo chemotherapy to improve their odds. Now, thanks to a large NIH-funded clinical trial called TAILOR-X, we finally have some answers, and they're good answers. It turns out that about 70% of such women actually do not benefit from chemotherapy, and a genomic test of tumor tissue can identify them quite reliably. Clearly, it's ideal to spare women from the potential toxic side effects of chemotherapy if that's possible and still have a good outcome. On top of that, and this will probably warm your heart because it certainly does mine, this move, basically making it not necessary to go through chemotherapy for many of those women, will produce a significant cost savings for our healthcare system, maybe up to $1 billion a year. Figuring out what health approaches work best for each individual and why brings me to the goal of another important investment of the Cures Innovation Fund, and that is the Precision Medicine Initiative. The centerpiece of this initiative, the All of Us research program, will enroll 1 million or more people, and we're off to a very strong start. On May 6th, just 2 months ago, the day we launched national enrollment in 7 sites across the nation, we reached more than 10,000 people just that day at community events, and almost 4 times that number online. As of this week, over 86,000 volunteers have signed up to contribute their health data in many ways over many years. Some are enrolled through health provider organizations, 10 of them that are part of our enterprise, and that includes community health centers and the Department of Veterans Affairs. Others enroll as direct volunteers who sign up over the internet. Altogether, I'm happy to tell you that almost half are from historically underrepresented racial and ethnic groups, which is one of our goals, so that we can utilize this to look at health disparities. Right now, anyone who's 18 and older, including members of Congress, note the URL if you're interested in learning more about how to sign up. You can join. Next year, we will begin enrolling children. We decided to first start with adults, but next year, children will be added in. And in 2019, we plan to open a secure portal to give researchers access to All of Us data in a de-identified format with exceptional security. With every new person enrolled, every biological sample preserved, every electronic health record collected, every survey filled out, this data will hold more and more promise for advancing human health. And with every new scientist mining this data in search of answers to important biomedical questions, the more that promise will be realized. This is groundbreaking. This exciting progress, along with many other advances in biomedical research, is being made possible because of the vision of you and your colleagues. So thank you for your investment in the 21st Century Cures Act, as well as your ongoing support of NIH. We could not do this without you. My colleagues and I really look forward to your questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Collins. Dr. Gottlieb, you're recognized for 5 minutes for an opening statement, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, Mr. Ranking Member, and members of the subcommittee. Almost 2 years ago, the members of this committee hailed the passage of cures as a potential game changer for patients. I agree. I've provided a comprehensive list of our cures activities in my written statement, but I'd like to focus my remarks on one cross-cutting priority under cures, and that's modernizing clinical trials. FDA has embraced innovative trial designs and novel endpoints and the patient-centered trials envisioned by the Cures Act. Our aim is simple: innovative, advanced evidence generation to assure the timely availability of safe and effective therapies. The Cures Act is catalyzing these approaches and catalyzing the development of new precision medical technologies that are enabling us to target, arrest, and cure intractable conditions. These advances aren't cheap. Access and cost is a big issue. And I know some question whether our market-based system for medical innovation is financially sustainable. They ask if we can afford this coming wave of precision-guided therapies. I'd say we couldn't sustain our system without them. New advances like regenerative medicine and gene therapy can displace costs associated with serious illness by restoring function and reducing reliance on costly medical care delivered in hospitals and nursing homes. The best solution isn't to reduce market incentives for innovation, but to make it easier to bring new innovations and competition to the market, all without compromising one bit FDA's rigorous gold standard for product regulation. That brings me back to modernizing clinical trials. Rising trial costs and complexity undoubtedly impacts market competition and drug pricing. It can be a barrier to getting timely competition to newly approved branded innovative drugs. One reason we may be seeing higher costs is because it's taking longer for competition to emerge in some of these categories where specialty drugs are targeting unmet medical needs. We studied this question at FDA, and the data confirms these trends. I want to share a snapshot today of what we found. We plan to publish the full results really soon. For non-orphan drugs that treat conditions affecting larger patient populations, 41% of the first-in-class drugs approved between the years of 1991 and 2000 had at least one competitor in the same class within 5 years. This rate dropped sharply over the next decade. For the same kind of drugs approved between 2001 and 2010, only 18% had a within-class competitor after 5 years. Another way of interpreting the data is to describe the lag in competition. For the drugs approved in 1991 to 2000, nearly a quarter had a competitor within 2 years. For the cohort of drugs where the first-in-class medicine was approved between 2001 and 2010, it took an additional 5 years for there to be nearly as much competition. And by year 7, competition still lagged, with only 22% of the newer cohort of drugs having any competitor. We see similar patterns in most rare disease treatments as well. These trends mean that costlier branded drugs may enjoy longer periods without facing competition from products in the same class, and this may increase their pricing power. We need to understand why. Part of this has to do with the difficulty of running clinical trials with a second-to-market drug, especially if there's available therapy for a significant unmet need. It's becoming harder and harder to be second, and that's a problem. Efficient, modern approaches to designing and conducting trials can address some of these challenges and help us get more information about safety and effectiveness at the same time. To advance these and complementary goals, the FDA is pioneering a number of critical advances in clinical trial design. First are master clinical trial protocols. These include basket trials, umbrella trials, and platform trials. These approaches can sharply increase trial efficiency and lower costs. They move away from one drug, one disease trials and allow the testing of multiple drugs against one or more diseases or disease subtypes using a common clinical trial infrastructure. Another approach is seamless trial designs that compress the traditional 3 phases of trials into one continuous trial. Through these approaches, you run one continuous trial, and as you enroll new patients, you expand subsequent cohorts of enrolled patients using the information you learn about the features that help predict benefit from a new treatment. We're going to be publishing a guidance very soon that lays out how product developers can conduct these seamless trials and how to expand cohorts as trials progress, and a clinical criteria that can be used to expand cohorts as these trials advance. A lot of time and cost of clinical development is spent waiting in between the starting and stopping of the 3 phases of trials, and seamless trials can compress this. Every American has already or will one day face a serious medical diagnosis, either personally or through a loved one. We need to reduce the burden and the cost of advancing care. The clinical trial reforms we're making today will help ensure more patients who find themselves in these hard circumstances have a better chance of finding a cure. and that market competition helps make those treatments accessible to everyone. Thanks a lot.
Thank you, Dr. Gottlieb. And again, thanks to all of our witnesses for agreeing to be here. We'll now proceed to the member question and answer part of the hearing, and will still yield to Chairman Walden when he comes in for an opening statement. But let me recognize myself 5 minutes for questions. And Dr. Collins, again, thanks for being here. Thanks for bringing your backup. So let me ask you a question about on the 21st Century Cures. We tried to identify ways to get regulations and policies that were inconsistent and to give you some flexibility to move past some of these that are overlapping and unnecessarily duplicative, to relieve some of the administrative burden. I think the Act asked you to review that, so can you perhaps share with us where you are in the review and how NIH has identified some opportunities to relieve the burden on investigators?
Yes, I'm happy to do so. And again, thanks to the committee for making all of those changes part of this bill. Some of them may seem kind of bureaucratic and administrative, but they make a huge difference to us in terms of the ability to carry out our mission. We've been asked, for instance, to look at the way in which we've asked our grantees to deal with financial conflicts of interest, which we think are very important for us to track, but where the mechanisms for doing that tracking were seen as unduly onerous, and we are in the process of going through that with our colleagues at HHS, and I think there will be some changes that will make that more of an efficient process. Another thing, again, this sounds pretty down in the weeds, but it mattered a lot to us, is the degree to which we need to do monitoring of what you'd call a subrecipient, where you give a grant to a particular institution and then they have a sub part of that to another individual. And in the past, our need to reach through and do very detailed monitoring, even of subrecipients, was something that we were required to do without a whole lot of reason for that. And so we've already moved to simplify that process. Financial expenditure reporting, a lot of the reports that have been done in the past produce data that not very many people look at, and yet at the same time we need to be sure that we're being good stewards, and that is also being simplified. We're looking right now at animal care in use and the oversight that is necessary, of course, to be sure that we're dealing with animals in an ethical way, but some of those particular oversight mechanisms are now being reviewed, and we've put out an RFI and gotten 19,000 comments back from people who have opinions about how we might streamline this process. Those are a few of the examples. Again, it was really helpful having those features into 21st Century Cures to give us the authority to do those things.
And obviously, ongoing, it is going to be important for us to communicate on this, yes. And if there are ways where we can provide additional legislative help on that, I think you could find the committee willing to have those discussions.
Thank you.
And Dr. Gottlieb, thank you for your comments on the clinical trial reform. And I always felt while we were doing the roundtables for cures that is where likely where the big money was. If we could reduce the time in trial, reduce if a product was going to fail, allow it to be identified and fail early, so we didn't spend a lot of time chasing something that was not going to pan out. So I really like the concept that you just elucidated about the seamless trial concept and condensing the time between phase 1, phase 2, and phase 3 clinical trials. I think that is likely to have a significant impact. One of the things that has always concerned me is that and we've had some legislation, there's been a little controversy, but the ability for we don't have a payer here, we don't have CMS, but for the researcher, the regulator, and the payer to communicate before something comes. I always got the impression that when hepatitis C, when Sovaldi came down the pipe, that the payers at the state level, certainly the Medicaid payers, were not ready for what was happening, but they had been prohibited from having those discussions because of current laws. So I am hopeful that we're able to do something, because particularly in gene therapy, or gene editing rather, where you have a one shot that's going to cure something that's a lifelong problem. I mean, that's huge, but it's likely to be priced out of the range of most average people's budgets. Can you comment on that, on our ability to communicate prior to approval?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I think I would say, fully address this issue, and your points are well made, and I share your concerns and have shared your concerns in the past. I think we've fully addressed this issue with the guidance that we issued earlier this year that was in part built off of a cures provision related to payer communications with product developers for purposes of engaging in value-based contracting and other economic kinds of discussions, where we've essentially established a safe harbor for those kinds of communications, where the FDA isn't opining on whether or not it has the legal authority to provide any regulation to that context, and some would argue we don't on First Amendment grounds. But even if we did, we would not choose to exercise that authority because as a matter of public health, we believe there should be robust discussions between product developers and payers for the purposes that you suggest, that so they can engage in value-based contracting, other novel ways to try to pay for these very novel therapies.
Great, thank you. Thank you for that answer. Yield back my time. Recognize Mr. Green, 5 minutes for questions, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and again, I welcome our whole panel here. Let me give an example of what's happened in the last 4 years. In 2014, we had an outbreak of Ebola in West Africa. There was no treatment for it. And today, what we're seeing in the Democratic Republic of Congo, we have a vaccine. What has happened in those 4 years, now cures came on in 16, but can Dr. Collins or Dr. Gottlieb share that? How did that become? I know Merck actually has the vaccine now, and but how did we get there? Because like in 14, there was no vaccine.
Well, I'll let Francis start because the vaccine came from him, and I'll comment on where it is now.
It has to be approved.
Right, exactly.
So NIH actually began working on an Ebola vaccine back in the 1990s when nobody had really paid that much attention to this, but we were concerned that this might at some point become important. So there was already a fundamental amount of basic science and work towards a vaccine happening for a good 15, 18 years before the crisis that struck in West Africa in 2014. That being the case, this was in fact a program that developed a vaccine in record time, but still not in fact for West Africa in time to have much of an impact on the actual outbreak, because by the time the vaccine was being distributed, good public health measures were already resulting in the epidemic waning rather quickly, which was a good thing. With the DRC, this vaccine, which is manufactured by Merck, but based upon a close collaboration with NIH. In fact, the phase 1 trials for this very vaccine were done in the NIH Clinical Center up here in Bethesda, showing that it was in fact safe and seemed to generate good antibody titers. That was distributed in DRC in a ring vaccination strategy and also giving it to healthcare workers. And we were very happy to see yesterday the declaration that this epidemic is now over. Did the vaccine contribute to that? It's a little hard to tell because fortunately this was a limited outbreak. DRC moved quickly with traditional measures. But I think, again, we are very well situated now to deal with an Ebola outbreak in the future. And in this instance, it was great to see how quickly the vaccine was available, got distributed, and was made available to those who needed it.
I'll just comment just to build off of Dr. Collins's comments. I think first, I'd make 2 points up front. First, I think it's hard to understate what a game changer this is. This is the first time that we now have a technology available in the setting of Ebola to intervene to stop the spread with something other than just traditional public health tools of isolation. I also think we should make note of the efforts of the manufacturer, in this case, Merck. The doses that were deployed in the DRC were donated. They shipped about 13,000 doses to WHO. The WHO handled the transport to the DRC. It was delivered under an expanded access protocol that was administered by the WHO. So this was very much an altruistic effort that helped in that setting. I will say that we are working efficiently to try to move towards a licensed product here in the U.S. Obviously, I need to be cautious what I say, but I feel optimistic that this will be something that we can accomplish in the near term, and we can have a fully licensed vaccine.
Well, and that's just an example because Ebola we had a gentleman from West Africa come to Dallas, Texas, and the protocols weren't followed. And so it impacted our own country. But using this as a paradigm on what we can do for other terrible illnesses that are developing. And I tell people on any given day, we have tuberculosis in the city of Houston. because it's an international city and you just don't check everybody. So we have to be on our toes to be able to do that. And the 21st Century Cures, I think, gives you some of those focus. But looking at the Ebola vaccine, in 4 years, we went from people worried it's going to get, and I was trying to explain to folks, more of my constituents will die of the flu because they didn't get a flu shot than will ever be exposed to Ebola. And we want to keep it that way, though. But I'm concerned about the growing threat of the antibiotics resistance, and that's why I sponsored a provision in 21st Century Cures to create a pathway for these antibiotics that would meet unmet medical needs. The provisions directed FDA and CDC to coordinate efforts with respect to monitoring antibiotic resistance and any other drugs approved under the limited population pathway for antibiotic and antifungal drugs. Dr. Gottlieb, what steps has the FDA taken to coordinate the CDC with the CDC to support policy that promote judicious antibiotic use and antibiotic stewardship?
We've taken a number of steps. We're going to be taking some additional steps to look at antibiotic use in animal feed, the length of the duration of use and the indications in which they're used, and plan to have some additional policy steps that we should be announcing within the next couple of months to continue to advance what we've already done in that regard to reduce the use of antibiotics in animal feed and limit one route by which we're seeing the resistance develop. And as well, with both the provisions in FDASIA, the QIDP, Qualified Infectious Disease Product provisions, as well as the LPAD that was also enabled in legislation passed by this committee, we've been able to create new pathways to try to provide additional incentives and additional efficient pathways to get new drugs to the market that attack some of these multi-drug resistant pathogens. I would just close by saying I think it's still important that we focus on trying to develop pull incentives, new pull incentives, and new ways to potentially reimburse some of these limited-use anti-infectives as a way to create additional incentives for the development of these products. And we're working on one such idea in conjunction with our colleagues at CMS to try to move towards a different reimbursement paradigm for drugs that are the kinds that you want to just put on a shelf and never have to use, moving towards a site licensing model as opposed to a pay-per-use model, which has been a traditional way that we've paid for drugs.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I know I'm way over time, and I'll yield back the time I don't have.
Chair, thanks, gentlemen. Chair to recognize the gentleman from Kentucky, Mr. Guthrie, Vice Chairman of the Subcommittee. 5 minutes for questions, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have a couple of questions, but first I want to say I know there's a lot going on in this great city, in this great country, moving forward. And a lot of times what's happening in this hearing, a lot of hearings make television. This one probably doesn't make a lot of primetime television, but it's important. It's extremely important what happened when a bill like the 21st Century Cures passed. I think got a voice vote out of this committee, overwhelmingly bipartisan, and really makes difference in people's lives. And Dr. Collins, you and I had a meeting the other day with a member of the band U2, The Edge, and I only point that out because he was talking about somebody that was close with him that had childhood cancer. And I remember walking away because I had a friend of mine that passed away when I was about 11 or 12, and she would be alive today given if she had the same disease this time, or probably would be alive today given. And the reason I point out U2 because I think they really, being Irish, really love this country, and they really put out what America inspires the world and does things throughout the world. And people throughout the world do research, but nobody compares to what you're doing at the NIH, what we're doing as a country, what our healthcare system, what our industry, public-private partnerships. And it's just a shame that the O.M. Marie song, we could use a little good news today. There's a lot of good news, and a lot of it's happening in what people in this panel is doing. We really appreciate it very much. But I do have a couple questions for Dr. Gottlieb. One, it's specific on the Cures Act. It codified many practices in the Office of Combination Products, but also included provisions to clarify regulatory requirements, improve processes. Can you explain how the FDA is delivering on these efforts in the complex area of regulation?
We've put forward a number of additional guidances as well as staff manual guidances on how we approach combination products in the agency. I mean, historically, it's been challenging for the agency. I think we've made a lot of progress in recent years. I think we've made a lot of progress owing to some of the provisions that flow out of the Cures Act as well. We set up a combinations council to try to adjudicate who has primary jurisdiction over these products, and we'll be putting out a guidance sometime probably this fall, end of the summer, early fall, that's going to make some further process reforms that I think is going to make it more efficient for products that sit on that cusp to move into the device realm, which I think is the preferred route for a lot of product developers if they can get there. So we're going to look for ways to find the most efficient route while being mindful, of our public health obligations in these circumstances.
Well, thank you. And also, you and I talked just recently on the telephone, and several of us here sent a letter concerning drug shortages and drug supply shortages. I know I've had a emergency room physician from my district say that sometimes they don't have just the simple things they need. They have to be more creative. They have to figure out other things to move forward. I know some of it was tied to, the natural disaster in Puerto Rico. I think you guys really went in and handled it. That's what people need to know. There are people in government that are trying to make things work. We have issues we need to address. But what happened in Puerto Rico to get pharmaceuticals moving again, what you guys have done. But I know there's still issues with drug shortage. I hear from EMS, emergency room physicians, anesthesiologists, just basic things. Could you just kind of talk, I got about a minute and a half, what you explained to me on the phone and what you're doing with your drug task force and what's pressing and what's moving forward?
So the challenges here are structural, in my view, Congressman. If it's not one thing in shortage today, it's going to be another thing tomorrow. And we're dealing specifically with sterile parenteral drugs, so sterile injectable drugs, and those are the ones that seem to be chronically in shortage. And I think there are structural problems in that, frankly, reimbursement has been driven down so low. Many of these drugs are manufactured slightly above cost of goods. So the only way to profitably manufacture them is to do it at a tremendous scale. So we've seen a lot of consolidation in this space, but we've also seen underinvestment in manufacturing because there aren't a lot of margins to reinvest in manufacturing. And I will say manufacturing these isn't trivial. It's one thing to manufacture a small molecule drug and have a margin that's slightly above cost of goods. It's quite a different when you're trying to manufacture a sterile injectable drug. So things go wrong, and when things do go wrong, since this space is consolidated, if one facility gets shuttered, it could take down 30–40% of the market. We think there's things we can do, applying additional regulatory touch to some of these critical drugs. If we could define sort of a category of what we would say are critical access drugs that we don't want to go into shortage. But quite frankly, I'm concerned that my regulatory touch is only going to exacerbate the problem insofar as it will increase costs. So what we're trying to do with our shortages task force is look at this holistically and bring in our colleagues from the VA and CMS and look at how we might couple some additional regulatory steps that we could take to mitigate shortages or try to prevent them with some potential changes in the reimbursement structure for certain of these drugs. We talk a lot about drugs that are priced too high, and there are drugs that are very costly and probably exceed the value that they're delivering, but there's drugs also that probably are priced too low relative to their importance and the cost of manufacturing them. And I think we need to take another look at how we reimburse these old, sterile, parenteral, generic drugs, off-patent drugs.
Well, thank you very much, and my time has expired. I yield back. Thank you all for being here.
Chair, thanks the gentleman. Gentleman yields back. Chair recognizes the gentleman from New Jersey, Mr. Pallone, the ranking member of the full committee. 5 minutes for questions, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. First, I have a question for Dr. Gottlieb, and then I want to go to Dr. Collins for a second one. Last week, FDA announced the release of its biosimilar action plan, which strives to encourage more innovation and competition in the biologics market, and I believe such action is critical and necessary if patients are to realize the full benefits of biosimilars. While 8 years have passed since the Biologics Price Competition and Innovation Act, only 3 biosimilars are marketed in the U.S., despite FDA having approved 11 of them. So have you noted yourself, Dr. Gottlieb, competition in this space is anemic. So I have 2 questions. First, you are well aware that the high cost of prescription drugs, including biologics, continues to be a barrier for many patients. As a part of the Biosimilars Action Plan release, you revealed that a recent FDA analysis that found if all FDA-approved biosimilars were available to American consumers, that significant savings could be realized. Could you discuss further FDA's analysis and the savings potential that biosimilars could offer?
Appreciate the question. We're going to be publishing the full results of that analysis soon, but essentially what we did is we looked at the experience in the European market where we saw product introductions and extrapolated that experience to what could have happened in the U.S. market if the same products had been introduced in the U.S. market. So we effectively took the competitive landscape from Europe, made some corrections for the fact that the dynamic in the European market is slightly different than the dynamic in the U.S. market, but looked at the percentage price reductions when 1, 2, 3, 4 biosimilars entered the market. And when we extrapolated those findings back to the U.S. market and then assumed that if every biosimilar that was approved in the U.S. market had launched, we extracted that an additional $4.5 billion would have been saved in 2017. So the savings are quite significant, and I think, if anything, we probably erred on the side of underestimating them by being very conservative in how we did our analysis. The savings aren't, when you look at the European experience, the savings aren't of the same magnitude that you see in the small molecule world, but they're quite significant. They start to approach the small molecule type of savings once you see 4 or 5 product introductions.
All right, so thanks a lot, really. Second question, well, I always want to commend you for your continued dedication to curbing gaming tactics used by certain manufacturers to delay or impede competition. But the question is, how can Congress work with the FDA as you implement the Biosimilars Action Plan to help facilitate greater competition in the biosimilar space?
I appreciate the question, Congressman. You know, we are going to look at some of these more difficult scientific questions that I think you know, could facilitate more competition, like interchangeability. But one of them in particular that we're going to be looking very hard at is being able to use the European product as a reference standard. We have situations where a biosimilar might be manufactured in the same facility and distributed in both the U.S. and Europe. We know that, but our knowledge of that constitutes commercial confidential information. So we have to require a biosimilar entrant to run the study against the U.S. reference product, even though the European product's the same thing, and the European product might be cheaper and easier for them to source. So there are opportunities, I think, to have cost savings if you could source a reference product globally. And I will add that about half the cost right now of developing a biosimilar, and it's highly variable, but on average, about half the cost of developing a biosimilar are the cost of acquiring the branded biologic to run the trial, to run the comparative trial. So the savings could be significant.
Well, thank you. Let me quickly get to Dr. Collins. You mentioned in your testimony that NIH is currently building the All of Us data resource, which will ultimately help researchers study the data collected from participants and connect to other large data sets. Making this data available to a broad range of researchers obviously has pros and cons, and the 2 major issues that come to mind are data security and participant privacy. So let me quickly put 2 questions into one. Given that NIH is asking participants to share intimate details about their health and lifestyle, how do you plan to ensure data privacy and data security? And are there protocols in place to share updates or study results with participants?
I'm going to ask Dr. Devaney, the Deputy Director, who's all over these issues, to respond to your question.
Thank you.
Great, thank you for the question, and thank you for having us here today. So we're thrilled about where we've come with the All of Us Research Program. We have over 86,000 participants. Of course, we know as we try to engage a community of diverse participants up to 1 million or maybe even more, we need to gain their trust. And so privacy is one of our most important priorities. We are, all of the data that comes into the data resource is encrypted and de-identified and goes into a secure cloud environment. And once we open up access to researchers next year, they will have to abide by a code of conduct, and no data will be allowed to be downloaded from that environment. In addition, and just really briefly, I want to thank the committee here for giving us really strong privacy protections within the CARES Act, including certificates of confidentiality, which cover all of our data and allow us to really provide robust protections to our participants' confidentiality.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Chair, thanks, gentleman. Gentleman yields back. Chair recognizes the gentleman from Michigan, Mr. Upton, the author of the Cures legislation. 5 minutes for questions, please.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I just want to remind everyone here that this was a great committee process that passed 51-0. And I want to say that everybody that was on the committee in the last Congress actually had a piece of this because we listened to everybody here. Staff was terrific, that's for sure. But so are the agencies, because you helped lead us to where we wanted to go, the administration, the Senate. We had all the disease groups. We had lots of players, and we appreciated that input. And I think based on the hearing today and what we really thought was going to happen, it's fulfilled our expectations, and we got a lot of time left to play. It is a game changer. And I got to say, way back when, I was one of the participants with John McCain and Paul Wellstone and Henry Waxman had doubled the money for the NIH back in the 90s. With the 4 of us were the sponsors of that bill to get it done. And it was a very important element that we actually increased the money for the NIH, knowing that we had a terrific steward in Dr. Collins that was going to be able to lead us there. And I can remember sitting upstairs with Mr. Pallone and Ms. DeGette, my partner, and a few others to talk about how much money we wanted to add to that baseline. And we got it up to $45 billion increase over a 10-year span. And the leadership demanded that we have pay-fors for it. And we came up with those not once but twice, as they were stolen the first time. And a comment that was made earlier, and it might be more important to have maybe someone from HHS here, but I was too alarmed last week when I read a story that HHS was perhaps reprogramming some of the money that we had done a dollar for dollar, year by year table to make sure that that money went for the NIH. And I don't know if, Dr. Collins, if you're able to if you have knowledge, if there is some truth to the published reports that money was being taken away from what we're able to do and put to something else. I don't know if that's happening, and if it is happening, how do we get it back?
So I'm not aware of the published report you're mentioning. There is, I believe, and we should probably check this, language in 21st Century Cures that prohibits transfer of the funds that are allocated in the Innovation Fund by the Secretary for any other purposes. So I think this is nicely designed so that those funds are intended to go for your original plan.
Well, that's good to hear. I want to talk a little bit about all of us, and it's I think the privacy protections are important, and it's very important people know about them, and they're not going to have to worry about that data being stolen. And as we found particularly from our round tables, individuals were more than willing to share what their own experience was, knowing that it was going to protect someone else from maybe having that same ailment. And so it's exciting to hear that 87,000 people have already signed up, really just in a couple weeks. I know for me, particularly with the privacy protections, we'd like to maybe set up a caucus here, an All of Us caucus, that can be bipartisan to encourage members and staff to participate. We've got about, 25,000 people that work here on the Hill, and maybe we can get a good percentage that'll come down to the Gold Room around the corner to figure that out. How quickly, I know that researchers are going to have access to this information in about a year or so. How quickly do you think some of that data might be able to be utilized and figure out the right pathway for some real important research to be promising? Obviously, the news in the last couple of weeks about the chemo and not having chemo for breast cancer was very important, heralded around the country and nicely. But how fast do we expect that maybe some of this All of Us information might be able to be used by the researchers with some concrete result of positive?
Sure. Yeah, it's a great question. We're really excited to get some of the brightest minds around the country actually accessing the data. And as you mentioned, 86,000 participants, that data is just going to get richer and richer as we add more participants and as we get more electronic health record data in on all of the participants. I would imagine that once we give access to researchers, that we would pretty shortly start to see some pretty significant findings. And of course, the data gets richer with more participants, but over the long term as well, as we get to see people who are healthy, stay healthy, get disease, how they respond to therapies, all of that will be.
And just real quickly, because my time is expiring, how long does it take for someone, if they sign up to do this, what's the time element for them to participate?
Sure. So the online enrollment process takes about 45 minutes to go through the consent and to authorize your electronic health record. And then we have the in-person visit where people donate blood and go undergo a physical measurement. That takes somewhere between 45 minutes and an hour as well. And then over time, we'll be asking participants to continue to fill out surveys and do other things digitally, and maybe even come back for in-person visits over the years.
Yield back.
Chair, thanks, gentlemen. Gentleman yields back. Chair recognizes the gentlelady from California, Ms. Eshu. 5 minutes for questions, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Good morning, doctors. It's an honor to have you here, and I can't help but think that while most people in the country don't know our names or what we do, they're all counting on you. So thank you for what you do. I think that you represent part of the real genius of our country, and I always say NIH stands for our National Institutes of Hope, and you gave us even more hope with your report, Dr. Collins. Dr. Gottlieb, I know that you're aware that the legislation that my wonderful colleague, Congresswoman Susan Brooks, and I wrote, the Strengthening Public Health Emergency Response Act, was included in the 21st Century Cures Act. And amongst other provisions, the bill established a priority review voucher to encourage the development of medical countermeasure drugs and vaccines at FDA. Now, when we developed the bill, the FDA at that time expressed concerns that allowing biodefense medical countermeasures to qualify for the PRV would dramatically increase the number of PRVs awarded. The first product was just approved earlier this month. So does the FDA still have concerns about the number of products that will qualify for the PRV under the legislation? Can you tell us if there's been good interest, on the part of companies to apply for it? Can you just maybe briefly inform us about that?
I appreciate the question, Congresswoman, and I think we all appreciate the effort of this committee to try to provide incentives to these important products. And as you noted, the first product that qualified for one of these PRVs was just approved by the FDA, and it's potentially a very important product, a treatment rather than just purely a vaccine for smallpox. The Holy Grail was always to have a treatment in the event of smallpox being used as a bioweapon. I don't think we could. I don't know what the position of my colleagues who were here before me, but I certainly wouldn't argue that we have too many medical countermeasures coming into the agency and too many PRVs being issued in this context. I think if anything, it's probably quite the opposite. We would still like to see more drug development in this realm, and there's still economic challenges to developing these kinds of medicines.
I appreciate that. I don't know whether it's Dr. Collins or Dr. Sharpless. Pancreatic cancer is still a death sentence. I did legislation some years ago regarding it. Can you give us an update of if the needle has actually moved? I know when I did the legislation, I can't remember the year, that the needle really hadn't moved in about 40 years. So can you give us just a quick update on that? And then I'd like to go to Dr. Devaney for a question.
Sure. I think the answer is yes. The needle has begun to tick ever so slightly up in pancreatic cancer. I was speaking recently to the PanCan, one of the leading advocacy groups in the space on this topic. And
marvelous advocates.
Yeah, do great work. And I think we've seen some really good stuff. So if you can resect pancreatic cancer, so you get a so-called R0 resection, those patients are doing pretty well. So resectable pancreatic cancer is a minority of those patients, but that group is growing, and we just had a positive trial, a randomized trial announced at ASCO with a significant survival bit for adjuvant chemotherapy in those patients. Other patients who do not have the RAS mutation, so the so-called RAS wild-type patients, which may be about 10%, some of those patients are responding to novel kinase inhibitors, for example. That are
I think I'd like to follow up with you because I'm not a doctor, so I don't understand everything you just said. Okay. But I know that you can break it down for me if we have a conversation or a meeting. I appreciate it. Dr. Devaney, thank you for your wonderful report. One of the places where the program is taking place is in my congressional district at the Palo Alto VA. Can you give me just a quick update, if you know, about the veterans that signed up to participate, how your experience working with the Palo Alto VA? I'm very proud of it. It's quite an enterprise there. I've heard from many constituents who are interested in participating in all of us. And I'd also like to know how you're advertising to the general public.
Sure. Yeah, I'll start with the VA. And we have a really, thank you for that, by the way. We have a really great partnership with the VA and have for years. And of course, they've been running the Million Veteran Program, and they have 670,000 veterans or more already enrolled. So we've learned a lot from them. Dr. Phil Sau, who's the PI at Palo Alto, has been a great partner. They launched a few months ago and have had great success getting veterans enrolled into our program, which has been it's a really important population for us because of course, the health outcomes that are so important there. And we have also a VA site in Boston. So we're excited to get even more VA sites launched around the country.
Great. And how are you advertising to the public?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, we're using a number of different tactics, learning over time how do we actually engage across a national, a study that's trying to be national. So we're using different marketing techniques, digital marketing. We're also doing in-person engagement. The healthcare provider organizations, including the VA site, are really critical for us because they have those direct relationships with their patients.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Yield back. Thank you again to all of you.
Chair recognizes the gentleman from Ohio. Mr. Lotta, 5 minutes for your questions, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you very much for our panel for being here. Really appreciate it and the testimony you've provided. It's important for this country, and also the gentleman from Michigan's not here right now, but I also want to thank him for his leadership on 21st century cures and getting us to this point where we are today. Dr. Collins, if I could start with a question for you. In your testimony, you talked in regards to the BRAIN initiative, and especially at the end of the testimony talking about that, it will lead to increased understanding for brain health and a means of preventing brain disorders such as Alzheimer's disease, Parkinson's, schizophrenia, autism, drug addiction, and traumatic brain injury. And I know I also see that there's been about $1.5 billion that's been allocated over the next 10 years for the studies that's going on. But I know that when I've been at Ohio State and seen what they're doing with Parkinson's and their studies, but the one area I'd like to kind of focus in on today is on Alzheimer's, because as we look across the nation today and we're seeing what's happening, and it's, the reports, especially from what Alzheimer's Association's reports, that you're looking at that the cost could rise as high as $1.1 trillion by the year 2050. 6 leading causes of death in the United States today. 1 in 10 Americans over 65 will have it. We have about 5 million Americans living with Alzheimer's today. 1/3 of Americans over 85 are afflicted with it. But unfortunately, when you start looking down the road over the next almost 30 years, people over the age of 65, there'll be about 14 million people afflicted. Where do you see the studies going right now with Alzheimer's?
This is an area of intense interest as a major challenge for the world, and certainly that's very true of the United States. You've quoted the frightening numbers of individuals that are projected to be affected and the cost that is going to apply to our healthcare system. And even more than that, the personal tragedies that happen every time a diagnosis of this sort appears and affects not only the individual, but their family and the caregivers. We are all in on trying to come up with an aggressive strategy to identify a pathway towards prevention and treatment of the disease. And we're grateful to the Congress because over the course of the last 3 years, Congress has been progressively giving us greater resources to work specifically on Alzheimer's. We're also doing that in a very I think, visionary, productive partnership with industry and something called the Accelerating Medicines Partnership to try to be sure that the basic science that we're doing on the brain, trying to tell what are the earliest signs of Alzheimer's, gets translated quickly into therapeutics. One of the things we are learning is that Alzheimer's begins long before the first symptom in terms of cognitive function. And if we're really going to be successful in delaying or preventing it, we need to find people at risk at the earliest possible moment and not wait until they're already in a circumstance of having lost a lot of the neurons, because they'll be hard to get back at that point. I am guardedly optimistic that we are on the right path with some of the trials that are underway right now, where we have the opportunity to treat people before they have any symptoms, but we know they're on a dangerous pathway and can watch and see what's happening. We're also learning a lot more about roles that play a significant hand in what happens with Alzheimer's and the immune system, which we hadn't really realized before. And inflammation seems to be important in this condition. And all of the focus that we've had on amyloid and tau, the 2 proteins that build up in the brain, are important, but that may not be the whole story. I could give you a long lecture on all of this, and I'll stop now because of the timetable. But I do want to reassure you that between NIH basic and clinical science, working with industry, and with close collaborations with the advocates, we are pushing this as fast as we possibly can.
And I would just add, if I may, just for 10 seconds, we work closely with Dr. Collins and his efforts, and we recently issued a new guidance document updating the agency's guidance on clinical trial endpoints in this setting, in this particular disease setting. Historically, there was a perception that you had to show improvement in both functional status and cognition to win approval, or at least show that you slow the decline in functional status and cognition. That's challenging because by the time your functional status declines as an Alzheimer's patient, you probably had a pretty significant decline in cognition. And now that we're able to identify patients earlier with more sensitive tools to detect changes in cognition, also pre-specify patients who are at high risk of developing Alzheimer's, what we want to do is intervene earlier when there are slight changes in cognition and try to arrest that process. And so what the agency has said is in the right circumstances, if you can show an improvement on cognition alone, that could potentially qualify for approval for a drug that would slow the progression of Alzheimer's disease in the right pre-specified population, the properly identified patients. So we're trying to work closely with NIH as well to help facilitate this innovation.
Thanks, Scott. That's really important to have that as an endpoint.
Well, again, thank you very much for our panel, and Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Sure, thanks, gentlemen.
Mr. Chairman, could I ask for the next member of Congress if Diane DeGette would come up and sit in the ranking chair as a co-sponsor of the bill?
Without objection. Ladies recognized, 5 minutes for questions.
Thank you so much. And I just thought Mr. Green wanted a break. That was very nice of him to recognize me. And again, I want to add my thanks to all 4 of our witnesses up here for their extraordinary help, not just in passing this bill, but also in implementing it. It really warms our hearts to see how much progress we've made in such a relatively short time, and it also encourages us to think how much more we can make. So I just have a few questions for each of our agencies that are here today. I think I'll start with the FDA. So, Dr. Gottlieb, the biomedical community has really made great strides in developing clinical therapies, from unlocking the potential of stem cells to creating therapies tailored to the unique genetic fabric of a patient. And one of the things we've been concerned about for a long time is that overseeing and regulating these cutting-edge therapies really requires an experienced, well-trained, robust public health workforce. And so in 21st Century Cures, we had a provision for new hiring authorities known as HR Cures. I'm wondering if you can talk to us about how the HR Cures Authority has helped the agency recruit and retain talent.
Thank you, Congresswoman. We're in the process of implementing that. I think it's going to be transformative for the agency in terms of our ability to recruit people with specialized skills. We've identified 38 occupations that meet the requirement for the alternative pay system. We've made the first 2 hires under the new Cures Authority, both deputy center directors. But I think this is going to be very important for the agency. And just to briefly pick up on your point, when we're talking about new treatments like gene therapy and cell-based regenerative medicine, and even the things we're seeing on the medical device side of the house, the clinical characteristics of the products relate very closely to the product features. And the product features change very quickly. The underlying technology of the product itself, these aren't all pills anymore.
Right.
And so it used to be that if you had expertise in the scientific field or the clinical field, you could adjudicate all the different kinds of drugs. But now it requires expertise also in the products themselves, the gene therapy platforms, the regenerative medicine platforms. And we see this a lot in the medical device side of the house, where there's a lot of novel technology that you have to have engineering skills on that specific technology. That's where this is going to be particularly helpful, trying to find those people with the very discrete specialized skills.
These are people, you can't just hire someone straight out of grad school. These are people with really specialized areas of knowledge.
That's right, and they're people who are often employed in endeavors in the private sector where they're highly paid, highly skilled, and so we're competing against others for the same small pool of talent.
In the FDA's June 2018 report called 21st Century Cures Workforce Planning, you talked about this patchwork of hiring authorities that have created challenges. Are you beginning to be able to address that?
We've had historical challenges with the overall hiring framework at FDA going back 15 years or longer. I mean, some of the same challenges that I'm grappling with now, I saw commissioners grappling with when I was at the agency in 2003 and again in 2007. We are addressing it very directly. We are trying to do a top-down, wholesale change of the hiring process to make it far more efficient. We started a pilot, which dramatically streamlined the onboarding process, the hiring process, and we focused that pilot on the PDUFA slots or the user fee slots. What we've decided to do is basically take the structure of that pilot and apply it to the whole hiring process and not just sort of bifurcate off one set of hiring positions.
I hate to cut you off, but I can't ignore Dr. Collins. And I have about 10 minutes of questions for you, but you're going to have a minute to answer them. Let me just ask you, what kind of research is going on over in your agency on alternatives to opioids for pain management? Because the opioid crisis is one of the big issues that's really been facing this committee for the last year or two.
Thank you for raising this. This is an incredibly important issue. We're grateful to the Congress that in the omnibus an additional $500 million was put into our budget to work on the opioid crisis, and a significant fraction of that is being devoted to just the thing you're raising here, the need to develop effective and non-addictive pain medicines for those 25 million Americans who suffer from chronic pain every day and for whom opioids is not the answer and actually is quite harmful in many instances. This goes all the way from basic science to discovering new targets to working with industry to help actually free up some ideas that have been on the slow boat and now can be speeded up, working in a collaborative way, and setting up a clinical trials network so that we can quickly test and see whether new therapeutics that are non-addictive work and in what setting do they work, because all pain is not the same. Low back pain may not be the same as the pain you get from trigeminal neuralgia, and we need to have all ready to go the kind of clinical trial network that currently doesn't exist.
I think, Mr. Chairman, this might be a good subject for a whole separate hearing. Thank you. Just one last thing, Dr. Gottlieb. I had some questions about some rules that have been pending about shock therapy in the FDA, and we don't have time to have you answer those questions right now, but I'm going to be contacting your agency to find out why those rules haven't been approved. They've been pending since 2016. And I promised my constituents I would ask you about this, so we will be.
I'll be happy to discuss with you how we're moving that forward.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Appreciate your holding this hearing, and I want to thank all of our witnesses today and the very talented men and women that you're speaking on behalf of in your agencies that do amazing work in the area of healthcare in America, cures. The legislation was passed, medical innovation, reforms to America's mental health services, and that's why I thought today was really an important day, an important hearing, to continue our work to legislate and evaluate and see what else we need to do going forward. What's working, what's not, what do we need to change? I know I've had a lot of roundtables, discussions, and hospital boardrooms and community centers and town halls with people in my district who are very pleased with the investments we've made in medical research and in turn the work that your scientists are doing to turn that money and research into reality and medicine and cures that goes from one end of this table to the other. And so we appreciate the work you're doing. I had a friend in Bend, let's say Carol, who's an MS advocate, who said cures was a great step toward making it possible to find a cure to MS. And I know you all hear that every day. People are pretty excited about precision medicine, the cures that are out there waiting to be found, and the work that you're doing. Dr. Gottlieb, in your testimony today, you suggested there's a correlation between lowering medical product costs and promoting modern clinical trial designs. Can you elaborate on that? Because we're all very concerned about the cost of healthcare, the cost of medicines, and you know clinical research isn't always as efficient as it could be, and how biomarkers and other drug development tools help to make that process more efficient and patient-centered.
I appreciate the question, Mr. Chairman. I think while clinical trial costs don't directly translate into how a product is priced, we know that. People price products based on what the market's going to bear and the value that's delivering. We know that clinical trial costs, development costs do factor into the rising costs of the overall development and the competitive nature of this landscape. What I talked about in particular today is that the complexity of conducting clinical trials, especially in areas of unmet medical need when there's already available therapy, is, in my view, delaying to market these second and third in-class drugs. So these specialty drugs that target unmet medical needs are enjoying monopolies for longer periods of time. And if you believe that subsequent competition, and the data shows this, when competition enters the market, prices come down, that competition isn't entering and the prices aren't coming down. And we now have data to demonstrate this. We'll be publishing that soon. I gave a snapshot of it here today. I think there's things we can do to try to facilitate more efficient routes to market for second-in-class drugs and third-in-class drugs, while at the same time increasing our assurance of safety and effectiveness, not sacrificing it one bit. And those are the kinds of development reforms that we're focused on.
And trials for rare diseases can be difficult to conduct, especially if there's already a first FDA-approved treatment. How do you spur additional innovation and greater market competition for rare diseases?
Well, I think, and this gets to some of the changes in the clinical trial designs. One thing in particular is in very rare diseases, looking at natural history models to model the behavior of the control arm, or using modeling and simulation, so you don't have to enroll placebo trials in those settings, because if there's already available therapy, patients aren't going to want to go on to a placebo if they can otherwise use the available therapy. They're going to want to use an active drug. So this is a place where we could benefit from more disease models. We should be able to create those. There's a request in the President's budget for about $20 million, which would help facilitate that. I know we have support from this committee and others in Congress for some of those resources, so we're very grateful for that. But I think there are things we can do working together.
Appreciate that, and a good reminder. Good promotion for the President's budget. Well done, well played. Send that to the White House. Dr. Collins and Devaney and Sharpless, I saw the NIH recently announced an effort called RESPOND, or Research on Prostate Cancer in Men of African Ancestry, defining the roles of genetics, tumor markers, and social stress. So that study, funded in part by 21st Century Cures' Cancer Moonshot Initiative, will investigate the environmental and genetic factors of prostate cancer in African American men. Can you tell us more about this important study and how it will combine molecular approaches and environmental science?
Dr. Sharpless.
Sure, thank you for the question. This is alluding to a trial just announced from the NCI that will be the largest trial of on this topic in our history. So it's going to take 10,000 patients, newly collected, and 10,000 historical patients, and try and analyze the genomes and social factors that contribute to this important disparity. African American men are more likely to be diagnosed with advanced prostate cancer and more likely to die of prostate cancer. So understanding this important disparity in our country is a really crucial question, and the RESPOND trial is very exciting.
All right, anything else anybody want to add? Dr. Collins?
I think I just have to point again to the All of Us study as a platform that we'll be able to utilize going forward for answering many questions of that sort. We have this goal, and we aim to reach it, that about 50% of the participants in All of Us are going to come from traditionally underrepresented groups, racial and ethnic groups. And so if you want to really examine health disparity circumstance, you're going to have 1 million participants who are highly motivated to take part in research, on whom we've collected a great deal of data. We're going to learn a lot about this kind of health disparity, about all diseases, once we have that platform up and going.
Excellent. Thank you all. We appreciate your continuing involvement with our committee. It's been positive and effective, I think, for the American people, and we look forward to doing more together. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
And Chair, thanks, the gentleman. Gentleman yields back. Chair recognizes the gentlelady from Florida. 5 minutes for questions, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and welcome to all of our witnesses today. Dr. Collins, I share your enthusiasm over the future of the cancer moonshot and precision medicine. Part of my enthusiasm stems from the fact that back home in Tampa, I represent the Moffitt Cancer Center community, the only NCI-designated comprehensive cancer center in the state of Florida. And I love meeting routinely with the young scientists and researchers who now feel like we have given them a new commitment where they were very concerned in the past on the future of NIH funding as it competes with all the other needs. Now they feel like, okay, 21st Century Cures, these new investments for the cancer moonshot gives them hope for all of their research and the care they're providing. Dr. Devaney, the Moffitt Cancer Center had been a national leader in building large data sets and tissue samples before, and working with other institutions
especially for those in that have that in underrepresented communities. You've now given us a bit of a outline on the importance of protecting privacy for the people who participate. Can you tell us a little bit about the protocols going forward for researchers? Will they be required to share their research? When would that happen? Will the research results be available to all for other researchers to build upon?
Great question. Thank you for that. Yeah, we've been thinking a lot about to your point about young investigators, the diversity of researchers also that can access the data, making sure that the platform we're building is open to everyone, and feel responsible for ensuring that the things that we learn on the data that is so generously provided by our participants is returned to the scientific community and to our participants, in fact. So we're developing policies around ensuring that researchers who access the data required to follow a code of conduct and share their results within a specific amount of time. And we're still finalizing those policies in anticipation of opening up the data next year, and policies around returning results back to participants who participate in the study as well.
Because Dr. Collins, in the past, it's been kind of siloed. If certain researchers kind of held it close and didn't make all the data available, what does the future hold, do you think?
I appreciate the question, and I appreciate that 21st Century Cures gave me, as the NIH director, authority that I did not have before to require data access for studies that we support. I could cajole in the past. I could try to embarrass people, but I didn't really have the clout to say this is a requirement. If you're getting a grant from NIH, you are required to make your data accessible. You all gave me that, and that has been a very useful tool. And we are very engaged in the process of trying to establish exactly what that needs to look like for a wide variety of studies. We've done it particularly for genomics, where we have a very well worked out genomic data sharing policy, and we're in the process of working that out for things like imaging and electronic health record information and so on. But this is a very high priority. We hate those silos too, and we've been having a good time knocking them down.
Great, we'll look forward to that. Dr. Sharpless, your predecessor at NCI, Dr. Doug Lowy, was well known for his research on HPV and the HPV vaccine. The part of the Cancer Moonshot isn't just the future research, but it's what NCI can do to help prevent cancers and detect them. Over the past few years, a lot of the NCI, there has been new NCI focus on making sure that there is greater uptake of the HPV vaccine across the country. Do you intend to continue with that? I mean, if we discovered the cure for cancer, there would be parades in the streets, but here is an actual vaccine that prevents cervical and a whole host of other cancers. I think it's important. Are you committed to continuing those initiatives?
Very, very much so. I should mention that Dr. Lowy continues as my deputy director, and he's been incredibly invaluable in that regard, because entering the federal process as an academic is challenging. And so I really appreciate Doug. His work in this area has been wonderful. Yeah, we have a robust, huge portfolio in this area. I think one of the most important studies is a trial of 1 versus 2 doses of the vaccine. Right now, the recommended is 3 doses. That's a big issue in terms of implementation in the community. So if 1 dose worked well, that could be game-changing both for patients in the United States or subjects in the United States as well as globally, where cervical cancer is an even bigger problem.
I guess it's a good reminder at back-to-school time.
Yeah.
Now, this is a vaccine that's appropriate it's important for boys and girls, middle schoolers, to get the HPV vaccine to prevent cancer in the future. Is that correct?
Yes, right. I think there are a number of vaccines that prevent cancer, HPV, hepatitis B, for example, and the dissemination of those things that work into the community is a real challenge for us in terms of the implementation science to make these effective therapies more available.
Thank you very much. I yield back.
Thanks, gentlelady. Chair recognizes the gentleman from New Jersey, Mr. Lance. 5 minutes for questions, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Good morning to you both, and thank you for your enormous public service. For Dr. Gottlieb, the Orphan Drug Act has helped to create a market-based system to encourage the development of new medicines for people living with rare diseases, most of whom are children. As you know, I am the chair of the Rare Disease Caucus in the House. In exchange, innovators are granted 7-year monopolies in the specific disease area. Since the Act was established in 1984, medicines have been brought to market for only some rare diseases, and there are many rare diseases, as you both know, where there are no medicines at all. For many of these diseases, however, there has been 0 second-generation newly innovative medicines brought to market for patients. In the field of lysosomal storage disorders, for example, there have been enzyme replacement therapies for 8 different rare diseases. The cost on average is nearly $500,000 per patient per year. However, with the exception of Gaucher disease, not a single second-generation therapy has been approved for any of these diseases since these first-generation ERT approvals, and most of those approvals date back at least a decade. In your view, Dr. Gottlieb, have we created perpetual monopolies in many rare diseases, especially in the areas I have discussed? And what are the barriers to moving innovation forward, to spur competition and innovation, and to bring newer, better medicines to patients with rare diseases as rapidly as possible?
Thank you for the question, Congressman. I think this cuts to some of the other issues we discussed here today, so it's a very relevant question. I do believe that there are settings where it's harder to bring second-to-market competition into certain categories. I would argue this is one of them. It's particularly the case when you have drugs that target degenerative diseases, significant unmet medical needs, small populations. It's hard to run clinical trials with new drugs once one therapy is available. Typically, the subsequent drugs will have to be studied on top of the available therapy, and you'll have to show improved efficacy with combination therapy as opposed to just monotherapy. It's hard to run head-to-head comparative studies when already effective therapy is available. People don't want to forego an effective treatment, especially when you're dealing with a child with a degenerative disease. I think there are a lot of things we can do. Earlier this year, we published in conjunction with our counterparts in Europe, regulatory counterparts in Europe, a master protocol, if you will, for Gaucher's disease and how you can study multiple drugs within the context of the same clinical trial structure for Gaucher's. We've talked earlier about trying to develop natural history models to model the behavior of patients who go untreated. We know how these diseases progress. We know how they affect patients. We should have really robust natural history models to be able to model that effect, so we don't have to enroll patients in placebo trials or rely as much on placebo, and that would make trials much easier to conduct. So there's a whole host of clinical trial reforms I think we can pursue to try to facilitate second-to-market innovation, which I agree with you is critical in these areas.
Is there something more we should be doing statutorily here in the legislative branch of government, Doctor?
I'd be happy to have that discussion with you. I think that there's a lot of things that we can do that we are trying to do and will do. I think one thing that I would just affirm, and I had this discussion with the chairman about the natural history models. We allocated $6 million earlier this year to develop 6 natural history models, myotonic dystrophy 1, a natural history model for the effects of sickle cell disease on the kidney. But we did in our budget this year request additional funds to develop up to an additional 20 natural history models, and those would be focused on these disease areas, these very orphaned, if you will, super orphan diseases. We would focus some of the resources there.
Thank you. I look forward to working with you as we have in the past. I have been the chair of the Rare Disease Caucus for quite some time, and this is completely bipartisan in nature, and we look forward to continuing the discussion. Dr. Collins, it's always a pleasure to see you. Mr. Chairman, I note in the audience John Crowley, who has been very much involved in the rare disease space, and his daughter Megan, and they are residents of New Jersey, and there is no one who is fighting for progress in the rare disease space than my friend Mr. Crowley. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back the balance of my time.
Sure. Thanks, gentleman. Gentleman yields back. Chair recognizes the gentleman from Virginia, Mr. Griffith. 5 minutes for questions, please.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I do appreciate it. Appreciate you all being here today. On June 8th, 2018, the committee, Dr. Gottlieb, the committee sent FDA a bipartisan oversight request for information about the FDA increasing criminal enforcement at ports of entry to combat the opioid epidemic, an initiative that you have championed and we support. The letter has only 6 requests. Some of the requests were first posed by an email to the FDA Office of Legislation on January 30th of this year. It is now late July, and the FDA continues to tell the committee staff that the letter is in clearance. Commissioner, could you help expedite the clearance of this letter so the committee has FDA's response before the end of July?
I absolutely will. It is in clearance. And we, in an effort to try to improve transparency and get that information out publicly, I did make a lot of the information, if not most of the information that's going to be in that letter, available publicly in some remarks I gave at a forum we had to try to work with internet stakeholders to address opioid sales online. So I have made the information public. I can make those remarks available to you. I think we've made them widely available. So, but I recognize the importance of getting the formal response back to Congress, and I'm on it. I face some of my own challenges up my line.
Well, and you have so much to do, and I really thank you for the good work that you're doing, and there's a lot of different areas that we've been working on together, and I appreciate that very much. What further improvements will FDA make to the expanded access program to ensure the process is effective and efficient for providers and patients, particularly now that the federal right to try legislation has passed? And while I like the House version better than the Senate version, we've got the Senate version. Give me an update on that.
Well, we have a process underway right now, a working group that's looking at what steps, if any, we ought to take to facilitate the proper implementation of the right to try measure. It's going to be a pathway that sits alongside our expanded access program. We're still going to operate our expanded access program. We did bring in an outside group, an expert group, to take a top-down look at our expanded access program, make some recommendations to the agency on how we can improve it. I'm going to make that public soon to provide some transparency around what they found. But we think that there are additional process steps that we can take to make it easier for people who aren't as sophisticated or physicians who haven't done this before to access that. We're also working with Friends of Cancer Research and the Reagan-Udall Foundation to create a platform to have sort of a one site of entry, if you will, to get information about what expanded access programs exist. I think that the challenge still remains the difficulty, sometimes reluctance, but a lot of times difficulty of sponsors to actually make drug available, especially when we're dealing with things like, some of these cell-based therapies or biologics where the cost of goods aren't trivial, and when you're a small company, you barely have enough product for the clinical trials. And I've been on the other side of this, so I know how that is. And so I think we still need to look for ways that we can provide proper incentives to try to make sure that when we have really, really promising therapies, we might be able to have supply available too to make that available to patients.
Well, and I appreciate that. I've been an active proponent of right to try for many years, and if people are facing death, they will take that Hail Mary pass and take whatever they need to if they can. Let us know what we can do to assist you on that as well. Dr. Collins, I'm going to ask you a couple questions just to give me an update. One, I have a partial answer that I already found on the internet, and that is with Lou Gehrig's ALS. I understand you all had a breakthrough this spring, but I also am interested in Huntington's chorea, and obviously I ask about these because I have friends who've been afflicted with both of those.
Those are both terribly important and often tragic neurological diseases that result in neurodegeneration. With ALS, as you mentioned, there has been an encouraging development of a new therapeutic approach this spring, still very much in the process of being evaluated. Huntington's disease, I will actually reflect a bit on, it's 25 years ago that my own laboratory was involved in the discovery of the gene that is responsible for that condition. And it has been very gratifying to see in the course of just the last year or two, still in a mouse model, very encouraging information about using a genetic approach to try to block the production of the toxic protein. And now in a human clinical trial, which we're waiting for the full data to be rolled out, but sounding encouraging, a similar possibility that utilizing a molecular therapy injected into spinal fluid, which then gets into the brain, may very well be able to provide benefit. And goodness knows, we've waited a long time for that kind of thing to happen, so it's pretty exciting to see. We've got a long way to go, I think, before we could say we really have the answers, but this is a lot different than saying we have nothing to offer.
I appreciate that very much and yield back. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Chair, thanks, the gentleman. Gentleman yields back. Chair recognizes the gentleman from California, Mr. Cardenas. 5 minutes for questions, please.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman and Ranking Member. Appreciate the opportunity to openly discuss with the witnesses the progress that we've made. And not every day do we as the United States Congress actually passed laws that we can actually look at and say, I think we did something good. And so I want to thank all of the implementers for doing good work. My first question has to do with the diversity in research of subjects. So thank you for testifying today. I was excited to read in your testimony, Dr. Collins, that about 85,000 individuals have already started the enrollment process for the All of Us research program that, and I quote, 70 to 75% are from communities who have been historically underrepresented in biomedical research, and almost 50% are specifically from racial and ethnic groups who have not been included in previous research. As you all know, diversity in medical research has long been an issue. I believe one way to decrease health disparities in this country is to ensure that we're including individuals of all races and ethnicities in medical research. So with that, my question is, what is NIH doing to ensure that All of Us research program recruits a diverse group of participants that is racially and ethnically diverse?
Well, we track that week by week. I personally am asking for that information every week to see how the enrollment is going, but I'm going to ask Dr. Devaney to say how this is being done, because this is unprecedented to have this level of diversity.
Yeah, and thank you for the question. This is perhaps our strongest priority as a program, understanding that ultimately a lot of the data scientists are using today is not reflective of the diversity of the country, and therefore what we're learning is not applicable to all communities. We have a number of different ways in which we are attempting to reach out to diverse communities and just kind of go into it with the understanding that we're going to try things and it's not going to work and we're going to have to, shift and try new things. One of the things I'd just like to highlight is working with community partners. We have a number of community engagement partners across the country who are helping us to build trusted relationships with their communities on a local level. And our Chief Engagement Officer, Dr. Dara Richardson-Heron at the NIH, has been sort of really working with those groups in a very robust way. And beyond our first 4 inaugural partners, we have about 30 plus partners that are national that are helping us to build awareness within their communities.
So you're talking about groups that are more local and actually might have a propensity for working with a particular population, whether it's an immigrant population or a Hispanic population or a Black population, et cetera. So working with local groups who already have relationships with those communities?
That's right, exactly. And yep.
When we did the launch on May the 6th in 7 different places, I was in New York at the Abyssinian Baptist Church with an African-American community that was totally revved up about the opportunity to be included this time. And I got to give credit to 21st Century Cures about this focus on inclusion. You've given us some additional tools there in many different projects across the board, but All of Us is really turning out to be a flagship here about how to do this in the most visionary way.
Okay. So this opportunity for us to remind ourselves that diversity in research when it comes to subjects in particular communities, et cetera, because they all genetically have different reactions, et cetera, and different propensities when it comes to certain diseases and cause and effect, correct?
Absolutely. And one should not assume that when you see a health disparity that that's something that's readily understandable on the basis of looking at one thing. Usually these are a combination of environmental exposures, of stress levels, of some genetics in there, but one shouldn't overinterpret that part because we're all awfully similar at the DNA level. Mm-hmm. And if you really want to understand the health disparities, you need to have these comprehensive studies that collect data from all those perspectives and then figure out how to intervene.
So it's better to have good research rather than having to force yourself to extrapolate out, and then that's more guesswork, and that's not necessarily scientific.
You want to have the data on the people for whom you're going to then offer some answers. We just heard from Dr. Sharpless a few moments ago about this big study they're just starting with African-American prostate cancer. Another example where we don't understand why men who have prostate cancer who are Black have a higher likelihood of dying and a higher likelihood of aggressive disease. We need to know that.
Okay. So what are some of the challenges associated with building a cohort that is racially and ethnically diverse? Do we have some findings or things that we're hoping to tackle in the near future that maybe you learned by venturing further into this diversity effort than ever before?
Yeah, well, we're just at the beginning of this journey, so we would love to follow up with your office and talk about this more. I will say we have community advocacy groups and participant advisory boards at all of the healthcare organizations that are part of our program that are helping us to understand what's working and what's not working, messaging, what's not working as part of, even things like your parking isn't close enough to the clinic and therefore it's too hard for me to make the appointment time to come in and donate my samples. So we've been learning a lot just from participant feedback and be happy to share as we learn more.
So as an engineer myself, having a good feedback system and adjusting all the way is important. So you're doing that?
Yes.
Okay. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for the generosity of time.
Gentleman yields back. Chair recognizes the gentleman from Missouri, Billy Long. 5 minutes for questions, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I'd like to give one more shout out to Diana DeGette. Diana is my co-chair on the Congressional Study Group on Japan. We travel to Japan together every year, and also to Fred Upton for their tireless work on this 21st century cures. And they just did yeoman's work, as a lot of you know. So I want to give one more shout out to them. My youngest daughter, when she was 25 years old, was diagnosed with Hodgkin's lymphoma. Today, she's 29 years old. She's 3 years past chemo. So the developments over the years, as Dr. Collins was talking earlier, have been phenomenal, and want to thank everyone. Dr. Sharpless, we were happy to support the Cancer Moonshot funding and the 21st Century Cures, and are looking forward to hearing about progress for patients. Can you tell us about the most exciting thing that is being supported in the Cancer Moonshot?
Well, that's really tough. I mean, there's so much good stuff. I think this is a very meaningful law for patients with cancer, and I think it's impacting in many ways. We already talked about the response study, so maybe I'll talk about the Rare Tumor Initiative, which is also a very exciting initiative. We mentioned rare diseases. Many rare cancers actually are hard to study for some of the reasons that came up. They're rare, they're hard to do clinical trials, and the NCI is a good place to study those things. We can have patients with certain rare diseases come to the NCI and get their care here, and this paradigm works, and the Moonshot is trying to build on that experience. So, for example, in the area of a disease called RASopathies, where different mutations that activate RAS, a driver protein in cancer, those patients generally present with childhood tumors. And the NCI now has a recent trial that we just had presented at ASCO, shown here, where on the left is a slide of Andrea Gross showing one of our scientists showing results of a selumetinib trial in these RASopathy patients. So this is a patient with NF1 deficiency. And my executive summary was the tumors shrink, the kids feel better, and the drug seems safe. Yay. And then a few parents contacted me and said, my child was on this trial, actually, and the responses have been marvelous. And so shown is the picture of the child pre-treatment on the left, and then this is Philip after treatment. And you can see his windpipe, his airway is not being compressed by the tumor anymore, and he has not the social stress of going to school with a big lesion like that. So this is a sort of pre-cancer syndrome. This is a mutation that activates RAS, this cancer gene, and this kind of study is a really great thing for the NCI to take on because of our intramural program.
Okay. And in the testimony, it says we must transform the way we conduct research, the way we share results, and the way we get discoveries into patients' care. Could you discuss how NIH is helping transform infrastructures needed to help meet these goals?
For junior scientists, you mean?
Uh-huh.
Yes. So the new funding from Congress has made it possible to increase the success rates for new scientists applying for their first grant, so-called R01 grant. So within the NCI, for example, we've set aside enough funds to increase that amount by 25%. We similarly are trying to lengthen the period of the award. We think that will allow scientists to concentrate on their science and not as much bureaucracy in terms of writing grants. So we're testing out a 7-year award as opposed to a 5-year award. And then one of the things we're really doing is thinking about the training opportunities we're providing for young scientists, both in the postdoctoral setting and in the faculty setting, so to make sure they get the right skills, for example, in big data, which is something that we really need more training in.
If I may, just across all of NIH, and again, thanks to the 21st Century Cure and the Next Generation Researcher Initiative, which is part of this bill, we have put into place efforts to provide a better chance for early-stage investigators coming to NIH with their first major grant application to get funded and then to have sustainable support so that they know they have a career. This year, FY18, we are predicting we will fund the largest number of first-time investigators ever at NIH because we have made this shift in priorities, and you helped us with that. with 21st Century Cures.
Thank you. I had a chance to meet with two early career scientists from the American Association of Cancer Research, and I was very impressed with the excitement and passion that they have for careers in cancer research and helping cancer patients. And once again, as a father of a cancer patient that is a cancer patient survivor, it's really means a lot to me. And thank you all for being here, and thank you for being here today, you all too. So I yield back. Thank you.
Chair thanks the gentleman. Gentleman yields back. Chair recognizes the gentleman from Maryland, Mr. Sarbanes. 5 minutes for questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you all for coming today. And whenever you testify, I'm reminded of the tremendous responsibility that you have heading the organizations that you do. And I want to thank you for your work to implement the 21st Century Cures, which obviously, as you know, is a point of real pride for this committee. So thank you for that. Commissioner Gottlieb, I wanted to ask, I know there have been some discussions already about the Biosimilars action plan that you released. I commend you for that. I have just introduced in the last few days something we're calling the Biosimilars Competition Act, which is to try to get to some of these pay-for-delay agreements that are operating in the biologic biosimilar space in the same way that we have given authority to the FTC to kind of police that conduct with respect to brand name drugs and then generics, where it has been consequential for sure that the authority is there, that they can look at these agreements, they can judge whether they're fair and appropriate vis-a-vis the consumer or not, and there's tremendous savings to be had there. I think maybe the figure is that brand names occupy about 20% of the drugs that are produced every year, but it's still 75% of the cost that's out there. And so, and I think that includes the sort of biologics, biosimilar distinction as well. Can you just speak to whether you think it's a good idea for the FTC to have this authority? And also, I think I understand from the plan that you put forward in your comments generally that you look for ways to cooperate with an agency like the FTC around this kind of thing to make sure that we're getting these drugs at the price point that they should be at.
Thank you for the question, Congressman. I haven't looked specifically at the measure, but I will. It's a little bit outside, the scope of my authorities. I have my own equities with FTC and trying to work with them to try to see how we can facilitate their interest in potentially bringing cases related to delaying tactics that might involve, for example, the REMS, where we can help provide information that could prompt them to take a look at whether those practices are anti-competitive, and that's been a big bugaboo of mine as well. I will say, just generally speaking, we like to approve safe and effective biosimilars, and we like to see them marketed, and we like to see patients benefiting from them. So, culturally, we like to see drugs marketed. It is the fact that most of the biosimilars that have been approved have not been marketed for various reasons. The biggest reasons have been patent delays. It's also a fact that a growing number of small molecule generic drugs ANDAs are being approved, but the drugs are never being marketed because of the changing economic dynamics of that market as well. I think we need to keep a close eye on that as well, because competition may be declining in the small molecule generic world as well.
Thank you, and we'll try to get this tool into the toolkit that the government has broadly to make sure that we're protecting consumers in that space. Let me switch gears real quick to you, Dr. Collins. And I know you got a question earlier, I believe, about sort of Alzheimer's research generally and some of the clinical trials associated therewith. But there was an article in the New York Times yesterday that pointed specifically to the challenge that's presented by trying to find sufficient people to participate in these trials. There's a lot of trials that are underway or sort of on deck that would suggest the need for up to 25,000 participants in these trials. And some of them could be really breakthrough, but I gather that this is a real problem, challenge, trying to find enough participants. Can you speak to what you know about that and what can be done about it?
Yes, thank you. That was based upon comments made by Dr. Marie Bernard, who's the Deputy Director of the National Institute on Aging, at the major Alzheimer's meeting that was held in Chicago. This is a challenge because we are now at the point where we're trying to recruit individuals who don't yet have cognitive decline, but who are at high risk for Alzheimer's by increasingly accurate means that we have, some of them using imaging, some using genetics. And we need a lot of participants in order to do that, but now we're reaching out to people who may not be that motivated to take part in research because they're fine right now. We are arguing that that is the best time to intervene, but it's not so easy to enroll. I will say, one of the dreams I have of the All of Us program that we've been talking about this morning, where you have 1 million participants who are pre-consented for recontact for research protocols, that will be a fantastic group to be able to enroll participants in studies like this for common disease, whether it's diabetes or hypertension or Alzheimer's. But right at the moment where we don't have that platform, we really are having a challenge trying to convince people that this is going to be something they want to take part in. We're pulling out all the stops, and again, the Congress having made Alzheimer's such a high priority for us, we have resources in order to do that kind of recruitment, but it is not simple because it's a different model than what people are used to, where you get approached about a clinical trial when you already have the diagnosis. Here we're approaching people who don't have that diagnosis, trying to figure out how to prevent it.
Thank you very much. Yield back.
Chair, thanks, gentleman. Gentleman yields back. Chair recognizes the gentleman from Indiana, Dr. Bouchon. 5 minutes for questions, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you all for being here. Honestly, it's a pleasure for me to be here. As a physician, I never thought I'd ever get to talk to you all. And I was at an event with Dr. Sharpless with Steve Rosenberg and Diana DeGette recently, and and the work that he's done over the years is, I can't even express how much of an impact he has had. Dr. Collins, you just said high risk. Who's high risk for Alzheimer's?
Well, anybody who gets to be 85 or 90 is at high risk.
No, what I'm saying is that people that don't know they have it. Is it if your mom has it, your dad has it, your grandma, because I think that would be an area that where maybe if one of your family members has it, you're high risk. I don't know.
So there are 3 ways in which we are currently identifying such folks. One is that you have a very strong family history, almost inherited in a dominant fashion. In fact, it is a dominant fashion. And there are those families, and if you're in one of those circumstances, we can track the gene in the family and figure out who has it long before any symptoms. Another way is to look at a genetic risk factor called ApoE4. If you have 1 copy of that, your risk goes up 3-fold. If you have 2 copies, 1 from each parent, it goes up 15-fold. So those people are very high risk. And the third way is scanning using a PET scan that picks up amyloid, because amyloid starts depositing in your brain probably 20 years before the first cognitive decline symptoms. So if people are worried about this, willing to do a scan, we may be able to say, hey, you're one of those that ought to get into this clinical trial.
So if somebody out there is watching C-SPAN right now and they're sitting there going, I wonder if I'm high risk. I understand the technical the tests and things that you do, but
yes.
People need to say, well, my mom had it, so I'm high risk. You know what I'm saying?
And indeed, that is one of the
And that's one of them, right?
But there are other ways to try to be more precise about it. If people are watching C-SPAN out there and wondering, hey, should I take part in this? We've just heard how difficult it has been sometimes to get the word out there. The place to go is clinicaltrials.gov, which hosts the trials on Alzheimer's disease and everything else, where you can find out who's doing a trial, what are the enrollment criteria, who do you contact to learn more about it. All of this we do very closely with the FDA as a partner.
Thank you. Dr. Gottlieb, my wife's an anesthesiologist, and in fact, she's out in the field today practicing medicine. She just texted me. She didn't even know you guys were here. And she says, hey, can you check into the fentanyl shortage? Because no, I'm not kidding. She just texted me. And she said, no, she doesn't. She's actually practicing medicine. We've demonized fentanyl, the illicit forms of fentanyl, right? But this is a very, very common anesthetic agent. And apparently there's going to be a long-term back order on fentanyl, which is honestly going to be a huge problem. You don't need to answer the question. I just want to point out that that what you're doing on drug shortages has real everyday, and you know this, but for everyone else out there, clinical implications in in the practice of medicine. She said Zofran, other common paralytic agents that she uses daily in her anesthesia practice are really in short supply. Fentanyl's a new one on me, though. She just texted me that. So thank you for your work on that and your response earlier on what y'all are doing on that. If you have any other further comments, because I got one other question for you.
You know, I will just say these are structural problems, as I mentioned before, and whatever's in shortage today, 6 months from now, I guarantee it's going to be something different. I've grappled personally with these as well as a hospital-based physician, so this impacts patient care. We're working very hard on this.
I know you are. So 21st Century Cures sought to implement personalized medicine and seek cures. This is a little proprietary question here. For diseases such as cancer, which rely on diagnostics, and I know your staff probably has told you I might ask about this. Unfortunately, the current diagnostic frameworks for laboratory-developed tests, LDTs, and in vitro diagnostic test kits haven't been updated since 1976, 1988. That's why Diana DeGette and I, another member of the committee, have released the Diagnostic Accuracy and Innovation Act, DIA, so to speak, to update how diagnostics are regulated. We've had a discussion draft out there for a long time. You all have had that, and we really appreciate your input. And we've talked to laboratories, patient groups, providers, and others, and we really need reform now. So I know you're familiar with the issue, and I brought it up in the past, as well as the committee's last hearing. You recently gave us a narrative on what the FDA provided us earlier this year in response to DIA, but I want to get diagnostic reform done this Congress, hopefully. So we're waiting for the red line of the bill from FDA, and I wanted to know if you have any insight in that progress.
It's very close, Congressman. We've completed most of our work, and I hope to have it to you very soon. I'd be happy to come into your office and brief you on it as well, but I think we're very close.
Great. I just want to reiterate, you have been very helpful, and I'm very appreciative of that, and we're hopeful to get this accomplished this Congress. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Chair thanks the gentleman. Gentleman yields back. Chair recognizes the gentlelady from Indiana, Ms. Brooks. 5 minutes for questions, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you all for your service to our country and for all of the incredible medical innovation. Just want to thank you because you all could probably be doing very, very different things in our country, and yet you have are here, working on behalf of all citizens, not just here, but actually around the globe. Dr. Collins, I'd like to ask, in your testimony, you mentioned that there are provisions that provide direction from Congress to ensure specific subgroups of patients are specifically included in research and clinical trials. I'm particularly interested in childhood disease and cancers, and having heard from constituents who have lost a child to cancer and are currently fighting the disease. We know that NIH is focused on improvements for children, that an area that's been lacking in the past. Can you elaborate on the implementation of the recently passed Childhood Cancer STAR Act, which was signed into law in June, and what kind of innovation are we focused on for childhood cancers and disease?
I ask Dr. Sharpless to respond to that.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for the question on childhood cancer. It's important to say two things about childhood cancer. While it's true we've made tremendous progress, fewer children are dying of cancer than ever, we're still having also true too many children die of cancer. And in particular, even when we're able to cure kids of cancer, we often leave them with lifelong toxicities. So they have survivorship issues. And I think that's one of the principal issues the STAR Act tried to address is the issues of novel therapies for kids with cancer, and then also the burden of survivorship that some of these patients incur through their curative therapy. And so the NCI is really interested in this topic. This was a personal research interest of mine when I was an academic, so I know firsthand the pain that many of these patients go through, or the suffering that this entails. And I think we have a focus on new research efforts related to survivorship, biospecimen acquisition, and then getting new advices and new voices into the NCI to make sure that we're adequately advised from the external community on pressing issues in survivorship. So thank you for the leadership on that important act.
Thank you very much. Dr. Gottlieb, as my colleague Ann Eshu talked about, in our focus on PAPA reauthorization, which it's critically important we get that reauthorized by the end of September. One of the things that has come up in various discussions with Dr. Cadlick and others is the importance of platform technology, the use of platform technology when it comes to innovation with vaccine. Can you talk about that to some extent? Because there's been frustration in this committee about egg-based vaccines versus platform technology.
So,
or if anyone would like to comment, I'm starting with you. But
I'd like to start if I can. I appreciate the question very much, and we have a proposal in the President's budget for some additional funding for the agency to try to support continuous manufacturing or alternative manufacturing. And we think this is really the direction that we want to head in, where you have closed continuous manufacturing platforms, particularly with recombinant technologies, where you can effectively have like cassettes that you basically plug into the platform and can allow continuous manufacturing of a vaccine. And if you want to modify the vaccine, you can literally plug in another cassette that codes for a different permutation of the same vaccine, same recombinant vaccine. We think that this is really the solution or a solution for influenza, seasonal flu, the ability to scale up manufacturing more quickly and produce vaccines closer to the flu season so you can guess the strain better, as well as have a platform available in the event of a pandemic flu. And these same technologies can be used to try to scale up manufacturing of other vaccines. In an ideal circumstance, what we would have isn't mothballed vaccine that degrades over time if it's not stored correctly and takes up a lot of space and is costly, but platforms that allow quick manufacturing of vaccines should we need it.
Outstanding.
Just say
Dr.
NIH
Collins.
works very closely with FDA in this space. If Tony Fauci was here, he would go into this in some detail, that the idea of having to build things in eggs is so much yesterday's technology. And the concrete example this past year with the flu vaccine having been surprisingly ineffective, turns out that the virus mutated in the process of being grown in the eggs. And so therefore it turned not to be a particularly effective vaccine for something that we didn't have control over. These new platforms, which allow you to build vaccines in a much more rapid fashion and much more directed fashion, DNA-based vaccines, RNA-based vaccines, once you have that platform going, you can very quickly adapt it to many different pathogens. And that's certainly something we're working on now to develop this universal influenza vaccine, which is a very high priority, and Congress has given us some additional funds for that, so that we wouldn't have to have the yearly effort to try to guess right. You'd have a vaccine that works against virtually all strains and would also be effective against that next 1918-style pandemic, which we are all worried about and which is overdue.
Thank you. And we did include a pan-flu provision in the PAPA legislation passed out of this committee. And with that, I yield back. Thank you for your work.
Thank you for that.
Chair thanks the gentlelady. Gentlelady yields back. Chair recognizes the gentleman from Florida, Ms. Bilirakis, 5 minutes for questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate it, and I thank the panel for their testimony today as well. Well, I wanted to, the first question I wanted to ask is this, we talked about Alzheimer's disease, of course, and what about Parkinson's? As far as, you know, we're talking maybe, how do you know if you're a candidate for Parkinson's disease to participate in these clinical trials if there are no symptoms, maybe at early stages? And if you could answer that question, sir, I appreciate it.
There are parallels here that are notable. There are genetic risk factors for Parkinson's disease, which is interesting because when I was in training and I asked my professor, are there any diseases that don't have genetic contributions? And he said, oh yeah, everybody knows Parkinson's is always totally random and sporadic. Well, he was really wrong. So if you have a variant, for instance, in a gene called LRRK2, your risk of Parkinson's goes up. If you have a variant in a gene called alpha-synuclein, your risk goes up. We are beginning to, therefore, be able to identify people at high risk and invite them to take part in prevention trials. Another big thing that's happened in Parkinson's disease in just the last 6 months is the formation of a partnership with industry called the Accelerating Medicines Partnership for Parkinson's Disease, with FDA as a critical partner in this as well. And really now figuring out how we could learn from a very large amount of data that's out there, but it hadn't been brought together. What are the next generation of drug targets for Parkinson's disease, and how do we accelerate the process of getting there? Because we have treatments. L-DOPA has been around a long time, but we certainly don't have things that actually prevent progression. They more treat the symptoms. And we believe we could do better with that. I should also say the BRAIN Initiative, which is this very bold effort supported by 21st Century Cures in the Innovation Fund, is learning things about the wiring diagram of the brain that is going to be very relevant to some of the things that are being done for Parkinson's disease with direct brain stimulation, where you actually put an electrode into the brain to try to take care of some of the motor problems. What we do right now is kind of clunky. As we learn the wiring diagram, we could be much more precise and more effective about that.
Well, thank you very much. Anyone else want to add something with regard to that? Okay, thank you. Dr. Gottlieb, Section 3088 clarifies that FDA has the authority to grant emergency use authorization for animal drugs, allowing the agency to approve the GMO mosquitoes for, again, Florida's Zika problem. We're planning ahead. Would you provide an update on the implementation of Section 3088, specifically as it relates to the approval of the GMO mosquitoes?
Sorry, I can get back to you with a more detailed update on that, Congressman, but I will tell you there's been some discussion about the nexus of authority with EPA for some of these products, but we did provide guidance earlier this year, I believe, that addressed some of these issues. So I can get back to you with more specifics about where that stands.
Well, I appreciate that very much. Dr. Gottlieb, a second question. As a longtime champion and supporter of policies that seek to promote a deeper level of patient engagement in the therapy development processes, I'm pleased with the progress the agency has made under your leadership. So, congratulations, and we appreciate all you do, including the FDA's moving ahead to implement the Patient-Focused Impact Assessment Act provision of cures that requires FDA to disclose how patient engagement data informed a review of any approved product. Where is the agency presently in implementing this provision, particularly efforts to standardize the inclusion of such information in the record of approved drugs so that it's accessible and understandable?
We've issued one of 4 guidances that we intend to related to patient-focused drug development, and we have standardized a format for the presentation of patient-related information in clinical trials. So when a clinical trial is submitted to us, there's a discrete, a very explicit section for patient-focused information. And on the medical device side of our house, we've done some similar things. We're seeing a very high rate of the use of patient-focused information and PROs in the development of medical devices as well. So this is a cross-agency effort across all of our medical product centers. We also just stood up a patient affairs office inside the Office of the Commissioner, reporting into the Principal Deputy, that's going to help advance some of these policies, really a coordinating office to provide a focus of access for patient groups, but also a focus of policymaking when it's cross-agency policymaking around these issues.
Okay, thank you very much. I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Chair, thanks, gentleman. Gentleman yields back. Chair recognizes the gentleman from Georgia, Mr. Carter. 5 minutes for questions, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank all of you for being here, and thank you for your efforts in implementing 21st Century Cures, legislation that I personally feel like is some of the best legislation we've passed in Congress in quite a while. So we're very proud of it, particularly coming out of this committee. Dr. Collins, I'll start with you. I wanted to ask you about, particularly about one of the initiatives of 21st Century Cures, and that was to really review the regulations and policies with respect to research in laboratory animals. And as I understand it, you're working with USDA now and the FDA to try to complete a review of that. And I just wanted to ask you if you could tell us the current status of that review, and when do you anticipate the completion of that review?
I appreciate the question. We are very seriously engaged in this, and again, 21st Century Cures gave us some clear guidance about what we ought to engage in. And we did put out an RFI back in March to ask for comments in this area in terms of whether the oversight that we currently apply to animal experimentation is sufficient or whether it has areas that are overly bureaucratic, which has been a concern. Obviously, we're deeply concerned about maintaining our ethical responsibilities in terms of how we take care of animals that are subjected to various experimental approaches, from which we learn a great deal that has led to many medical advances. We got 19,000 responses to that request, and they're currently being sorted at the moment. We would expect, therefore, to have, based upon those, a draft set of recommendations about animal care and use sometime probably in September. We will then need to have responses to that, and so we would hope to have a final version of this by December or early in 2019.
Great, great. Any opportunities that you've identified thus far that may help you?
I think there are concerns that some of the requirements we put on grant applicants in terms of animal care and use could be delayed until the award is actually made, as opposed to asking them to have all of those things in place when they submit an application, because that can add a lot of time and effort. And obviously our concern is if we're going to actually make the award, we want to be sure that the animal care is being done in the best possible way. That is one area. Obviously, there are differences of opinion here.
Yes.
And we're seeing those in those 19,000 responses. And at some point, we have to try to come down in what we think is a fair and balanced approach.
And I'm sure you'll reach that, and I'm very confident. Let me switch gears here and talk about something that's very exciting to me as a pharmacist, and that's precision medicine. And that's something that I see, genomic testing and everything is something I see as the wave of the future and great opportunities for us in healthcare. But I'm concerned when we get all this data in, we're struggling already with our electronic health records. You know, how are we going to handle this? I'm going to ask you that, and then I'd like to ask Dr. Gottlieb as well.
Well, I'll say a word, and then I'll ask Dr. Devaney to say a little more as the Deputy Director of the All of Us program. We are very invested in looking at this in the fashion that is cutting edge as far as dealing with very large data sets, putting the data into the cloud. We just had a very interesting all-day workshop on Monday on artificial intelligence and machine learning and how that can be applied to these unprecedented data sets to glean the maximum amount of information out of there, while at the same time maintaining the confidentiality, the security systems that the participants in this are going to expect about their de-identified data. But maybe, Dr. Devaney, you might want to say a little
Sure,
bit more.
please.
Yeah, I'd love to add to that. So, one of the data types that's going to be, I think, the most essential to precision medicine, or one of, is information from electronic health records. And this is one of the largest challenges for our program. We have direct partnerships with many healthcare organizations, and we're getting those data continuously from those partnerships. But we're also working on other strategies, including one in partnership with 4 of the largest EHR vendors right now to work on making the data transmission much more seamless across provider lines and into the program when a participant authorizes it.
Great. Dr. Gottlieb, I know this is important in drug data development as well.
I appreciate the question. I would just take it a step up the continuum to try to make effective use of the data, because there's so much information. How can we make effective use of the data in a way that it can translate to clinical benefits to patients? And I think this is where some of the issues we talked about earlier around clinical trial innovation comes in, where you have the ability now, with a seamless clinical trial design, to effectively bias enrollment in the trial for some of the genomic information and predictive information that's likely to predict who's more likely to benefit from a treatment and who's less likely to experience a side effect. And so if we can use this information in that way to structure trials and enrollment, we can end up with much more information about who's likely to benefit from a drug and more tools to make sure the right drug gets to the right patient at the right time. We've talked about this for decades. We now have that technology at hand.
And I can sense the excitement in your voice, and it's exciting for me as a healthcare professional as well. I just look into the future of this and just think, wow, what we've got to look forward to. Thank you. And I yield.
Chair, thanks, gentlemen. Gentleman yields back. The chair needs to state that without objection, all members' opening statements will be made part of the record. The chair asks if the gentleman from Texas has a unanimous consent request. No, concerning Alzheimer's. Were you going to ask that additional information be forwarded to the committee about Alzheimer's?
Oh, if you could, just send it to the committee on some of the information you couldn't have given us today because of the time limits.
Happy to do that.
Thank you.
And
I forgot what I was going to ask.
And I also, the chair would like to make the observation, and Dr. Collins, you started out this hearing with the remark about the immunotherapy and some of the dramatic things that have occurred, and it predated our work, our passage of the Cures Bill, but former President of the United States in July of 2015 went public with the information that he had metastatic melanoma to the brain and the liver. And remembering my time in medical school, my initial thought was, we will not have this individual with us by Labor Day. But it has really been dramatic to see him a year later deliver a speech at the Democratic Convention. A year and a half then, he was present at the inauguration in 2016 in January 2017. I don't know what his clinical status is now, but it was truly dramatic. And again, all of you are to be congratulated for making that possible. And hats off to former President Carter for going public with the information and entering a clinical trial, because that is the way information is gathered and learned. So I felt obligated to make mention of that milestone. Seeing that there are no further members wishing to ask questions, I do want to thank our witnesses for being here today. Pursuant to committee rules, I remind members they have 10 business days to submit additional questions for the record. I ask the witnesses to submit their responses in receipt of those questions. Without objection, the subcommittee is adjourned.